afternoon, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. My name is Tony Bell, President and CEO of Phoenix Consulting Co. I'm also a member of CMC Board of Trustees. It's mission affirming to have you as the collective us this day. And let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Cover My Meds. We also want to thank Grange Insurance Audubon Center and its wonderful staff for its ongoing support. Big round of applause. Thank you as well to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for presenting today's live stream, which is carried on all of CMC's social media platforms. Let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. Today is a global day celebrating the social, economic, and cultural political achievements of women. Thank you for coming together this day to celebrate women's achievement and to continue to work for women's equality. Happy International Women's Day, everyone. Speaking of women's achievements, today's forum will focus on an effort that Columbus is creating a safe space for women of color to dream and connect. According to a 2021 McKinsey report, 32% of Black women who have spoken out against discrimination, and it's really hard to do, let me tell you, it's hard to do that. So when you do it, they have experienced retaliation compared to just 6% of white men. Most recently, in December of 2022, Marguerite Ward and Alexandra York published an article reporting that Black women are being pushed out of corporate America by microaggressions, belittling, and burnout. And in a world lacking inclusive work environments, one solution is to build that inclusive environment from the ground up. So, Columbus-based Zora's House is doing just that, building from where? The ground up. Thank you very much. Founded in 2018 as a co-working incubator for women of color, Zora's House recently announced its massive $5 million expansion that will see the facility in Weinland Park grow to more than 10,000 square feet. Come on. Yes. I see a CMC forum being hosted there in our future. To set the stage for today's conversation titled Black Women Entrepreneurs, Building Success at Zora's House, whose mission is to help women of color start, nurture, and grow their own businesses, please join me in welcoming Catherine Ziegler from our sponsor, Cover My Meds, to introduce today's speakers.
Oh my God, thank you. Yeah, so I was given 2 minutes to introduce the panel. I'm from the South, so I'll try to stay on task. Again, thank you, Tony. As a member and supporter of Zora's House, it is a pleasure to be here on behalf of Cover My Meds. At Cover My Meds, we're committed to creating an inclusive workplace, what we call a culture of belonging, where all employees can feel safe, valued, respected, and heard. That's one of the many reasons we're honored to sponsor today's event, which not only highlights the expansion of Zora's House, but it also encourages a conversation about the importance of building safe spaces for women of color. We're inspired by the community Zora's House continues to build and the incredible impact they have in Central Ohio. Currently, we have 16 employees, myself included, who use the space, services, and network that Zora's House provides. So, thank you. I feel there's immense value in creating spaces and communities where diverse women can authentically show up and support one another. At Cover My Meds, I have the privilege of being vice chair of one of 11 employee resource groups, providing our employees with a safe space that fosters a sense of belonging, diversity, and inclusion. I've experienced firsthand the power of the Zora's House Network, as it's allowed me the opportunity to support, I'm gonna try not to cry, a minority woman-owned business in our community. And I'm gonna pause because that person is in the room today, and I didn't expect to see them. So again, it just kind of brings that sense of purpose full circle. And again, thank you for creating that opportunity for people like us. As we celebrate thank you. Yeah, that's unscripted. That's not part of the speech. As we celebrate International Women's Day, I am beyond honored to introduce today's forum, and I encourage you to join me in welcoming today's dynamic speakers. First, Elsie Johnson, founder. I'm like, does she really need an introduction? Founder and CEO of Zora's House. Danielle Sydnor. Danielle is CEO of the Rise Together Innovation Institute. And our host, Alison Marker, president. So we got founder, CEO, presidents, I'm just saying, okay? CEO of Marker Construction, so thank you. You can learn more about these dynamic speakers in your forum flyers. And Alison, with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you. I am looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. All right, well, hello everybody, welcome. It is amazing to see so many people here today to celebrate and be a part of this conversation, and such a beautiful crowd with lots of color, and I love all the pink and purple and celebration of International Women's Day. I'm also just very honored to be up here and be having this conversation with you too. So, how you guys doing?
Doing well, ready to go.
Ready? Okay, all right, cool. Well, let's go. I know we have a lot we want to talk about today. So to kick off the panel, could you each introduce yourselves and your organizations and just let us know a little bit more about your journey, your organization's missions?
So first and foremost, I don't think CMC knew what they were doing when they had all these black women up here speaking this morning. Allison snuck up in here, but she's our white friend, so it's okay. We love you, Allison. So as Allison mentioned, my name is Elsie Johnson. I'm the founder and CEO of Zora's House. I am so excited to be here and chatting with all of you today. I think the topic is a really important one, especially on International Women's Day. So for those of you who aren't very familiar with Zora's House is the only co-working space and leadership incubator in the state of Ohio that is created by and for women and gender expansive people of color. And one of the things that I always like to note when I'm talking about the work of Zora's House, it makes me think back to the very early days of founding Zora's House. And I would go out and I would talk to funders and other potential community partners, and I'd let them know about what it was that I was trying to create at Zora's House. And many of those folks would say things like, oh, we already fund, women of color. And I'd ask, okay, well, what do you fund? And they'd say, oh, we fund the homeless shelter, we fund the food bank, we fund this poverty initiative. And it became very clear that for many people, the phrase women of color was synonymous with low-income women. And they were not prepared to see women of color and gender-expansive people of color across a spectrum of experiences and opportunity to lead and create and shape our community. And so one of the things that I always like to be really clear about when I talk about Zora's House and we talk about being a leadership incubator, what we mean when we say that is that we want to ensure that women of color have what they need, not just to survive in our community, but to create, to dream, to lead. I jokingly said at an event a few months ago, we had a bunch of CEOs and leaders in the room, and I told them, I was like, Zora's House is not going to be successful until the folks who are in our membership got your job. So our goal is really to ensure women of color thrive.
So I appreciate LC because I was supposed to be moderating this panel, and she's like, let's switch it around. And I want Danielle to be the panelist with me because this is who LC is. But coming to Columbus about 18 months ago to lead the Rise Together Innovation Institute, I am not the founder, but I am the CEO. There was an organization that predated me, a council that really helped to develop this as a result of a public-private partnership between the Franklin County Commissioners to develop an organization that would look at implementing big ideas to reduce poverty. And I think it's really powerful, kind of after what you just said about this belief and this perception that when we talk about people of color, oftentimes it is interchangeable with poverty. And the reality that the majority of folks that are actually in poverty in Franklin County by just sheer numbers are white people. And it's a part of our conversation that we don't have enough about who is impacted by the decisions that we're making and how we have to work collaboratively together to make sure people get a chance to be represented all across our community at every stage of their life cycle. Because regardless of where you start, we also all have the opportunity to finish strongly. So I'm excited to be here and thinking about how organizations like RISE and Zora's House will work together to change the dynamic of Franklin County as we continue to grow in population and economic power.
Awesome, thank you. So Elsie, this question is for you. Zora's House provides so many powerful and important resources for women of color to start their businesses and become leaders. Talk about why this is important and the impact that this has on Columbus, our state, and even our region.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's interesting that I have Danielle here because one of the things that I often reference in talking about Zora's House is the fact that women of color are the fastest growing population in Franklin County. So when we're having conversations about what it is going to take for Franklin County to make sure that we are thriving as a community, that we are moving forward, that we are growing, there is no conversation about Franklin County that can be had without thinking about what do women of color need in order to be successful, in order to be able to contribute. And so, you know, it's interesting because Zora's House is a co-working space, one of the first assumptions that folks make is that primarily what we do is support Black women or women of color entrepreneurs, when in fact, we like to think of ourselves as a leadership incubator for a reason. We feel like there are a number of ways that women of color can and should be contributing to our community. And so whether that is we often talk about incubating women of color scholarship, creativity, activism, entrepreneurship, and leadership. And so that is very important because again, we think there's a whole spectrum where we still need additional support. But what was interesting was that we had been talking about, entrepreneurship and our little mission statement and our sales pitches for a few years before we actually started one of our kind of like premier entrepreneurial support programs at Zora's House. And that program really emerged during the pandemic. What ended up happening, like many of the programs that we have at Zora's House, they are truly inspired by the needs and responsive to the needs of our membership. So we often say we don't build for women of color, we build with women of color. And what we saw during the pandemic was there were a number of our members who reached out to us and they said, hey, I'm feeling like, I'm about to get laid off from my job, or I have gotten laid off from my job, or just to keep it all the way 100, like it is now a toxic work environment because of everything going on in the world. I have to figure out how to make my side hustle my main hustle. Zora's House, what y'all gonna do? And so we kind of really took on that charge and we ended up developing the Her Way Business Builder program in collaboration with Rev One Ventures and Aventi Enterprise. And funded in part by our friends at PNC. I gotta shout out all the people who give us money, so they'll keep giving us money. And so that was a major moment for us where we saw this need. And again, we said, we need to create a program that's a little bit different than what's out there because we recognize that many of the women of color in our program might already have a full-time job. And this is a thing they're trying to do on the side. And they have families and they have community responsibilities. And maybe they have a six-figure professional gig, but their family members are still in poverty. There are a lot of complexities that come with supporting women of color that have to do with the ways in which we have or have not had access to the resources to make sure that we are financially healthy. So I think that work that Zora's House is doing is incredibly important. And again, it's not just something that we created out of thin air, but our members actually said this is something that we need.
Thank you, Elsie. And Danielle, with Rise Together, talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and how that intersects with Elsie and Zora's House work.
So Rise Together is designed to think about implementing ideas that help people obtain their own economic self-sufficiency. And I can't think of a better way than really creating space for people to lead and to be empowered and for us to kind of get out of the way sometimes. Because we do have this design a lot of times in providing assistance where it's like, I'm gonna help you do this and you need me to do that for you. And I think about the fact that I could wear my hair in this curly style today with my curls popping because some Black woman was able to have the space to create a natural hair care brand. Because when I grew up, we didn't have products. And it wasn't because we didn't need them, but it was access to capital that allowed you to move into industries that have barriers to entry. It's easy to do service-based sector type of work because it doesn't a lot of times have that higher cost of capital to do it. But when you need to buy heavy equipment and machinery and you need to do things like put a product on a shelf that may take 120 days before somebody buys and pays you back, you can't just do that with your own bootstrap mentality that oftentimes, especially communities of color, are looked at to say, why do you need access? You should just be able to figure this out like everyone else did. And so I think that the work together for organizations like RISE and Zora's House will really be saying, what does access look like at leadership tables so that when we're making decisions about where investment goes in our communities from the federal, state, and local level, we have people that are most impacted by those decisions at the table, and that we're not tokenizing people and putting them in rooms just for the checking of the box to say that we did it, but that people are empowered to be at those tables and have the conversations and to defend their ideas and to know that their voice is going to be heard. And so we're designing a model that will allow us to have those kind of strategic intersections with organizations that are already doing the work. And I'm really excited that my board is giving me the autonomy to create in that way because we're not trying to go out and replicate things that already exist. We want to partner with those organizations. And collaboration and partnership in the nonprofit world can be nasty words sometimes. Because if you start to look too much like the organization next to you, you're like, my funder's gonna tell me they're not gonna give me any more money. But I'm here to say that we can collaborate and we can partner and we can still have our very distinct lanes of what we do well.
I just want to say, I don't know who is giving us the affirmation from this corner, but keep it up, because we appreciate y'all right now.
Love it, love it. Well, speaking of community partnerships, how do these spaces benefit from community and business partnerships, and how can businesses that are here, individuals that are here, get involved and help with the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so it's always really interesting. We get a lot of folks, especially now that Zora's House is more publicly building a new facility, and we have a really exciting opportunity to start thinking about not just how are we impacting the individual lives of the women of color who come through our space, but also like on a larger scale, what does that mean for Columbus as a whole? What does that mean for Franklin County as a whole? Like what happens when we get that tipping point of women of color who are, have that access to capital, that are at leadership tables, who have that level of confidence to pursue the things that they really want to pursue? How does our community transform when that happens? And so we have the opportunity to form partnerships, as Danielle said. One of the things that we've learned as we've grown is that we cannot do this work alone. It has to be in collaboration because we can't be everything to everybody. And the other thing that I would say, because you asked, like, how can people get involved? I always tell folks, especially for our allies in the room, but not just for our allies, educate yourself. Educate yourself around these issues. Educate yourself around some of these structural challenges that your colleagues, that your neighbors, that other folks in our community or in your life may be facing. Because very often people come to Zora's House and they're just like, we love what you're doing, but they're not prepared to really understand what we're doing. And so I think it's so important because it can be very overwhelming to think about where is your place within this work, especially as it pertains to racial equity work and gender equity work. And so I would say to start to educate yourself around the issues that are prevalent so that when you go into a space where work is being done, you already understand the context and you're not asking people who are also doing the work to educate you around the context in order for you to participate.
So I think the business community can do three things. One is look at this work as investment and not charity.
That part.
Lift your cup. And I give this example, and I won't pick on any specific organization, but when we approach this work from a place of investment, when someone's trying to obtain market share, they set a budget and they say, whatever it costs for me to go and acquire X number of Z part of the community, I'm gonna spend that money because I expect a return on my investment. That same organization will take charitable dollars and say, that's all I got. You organizations figure out how to divide that charitable pot of money. When we're talking about the fact that 1 in 7 people in Franklin County are living in poverty, we will not be the place that allows our employers to continue to have successful, thriving businesses. Our neighborhoods will not be able to have the disposable income to buy the goods and services from said organizations if we do not invest in people. And why not? Why not invest in the fastest growing population in our community, which are women of color? And women of color are starting businesses, they're the most educated, all these statistics. We also look at the way that the business community can think about who's leading inside of organizations. Again, the reality is you're only able to really look at the universe from the lens of experiences that you have. And so when you think about the ways that you could be breaking into new industries or products or tools that could be necessary for the population that you want to serve, your customer base oftentimes is extremely diverse. And so from a leadership perspective, if you're not also replicating that and not just doing it in a way that someone gets that seat, but how do you retain and how do you give someone the space to really lead? And to the last thing I would say is to give the business community should do is give people the chance to fail. We don't get the privilege of failure. That's a big deal. When I walk into a room, if I have to be right 100% of the time, I may just not show up. But if I know I'm gonna be given the grace to take chances, in the venture world, we say that 10%, 2% of the businesses succeed. That means 98% fail. And it's a whole lot of money going into the venture space. So give us the same ability to try things that may not work the first time, but wrap your arms around us to keep figuring out that thing that actually is going to work.
That was deep. That was deep. Yeah, thank you. Since it's International Women's Day especially, I would love to hear you guys talk about what it's like as Black women to be leading in your communities and making spaces for other Black women, to know that you're creating space for others to develop their voices and grow.
You want to start? I'll start, because I think I want to listen to what you got to say now. I first have to acknowledge all of the Black women that came before me that created space for me to be able to sit at this table today and confidently talk the stuff that I talk, because it was someone that took a lot of the flack on the chin to be able to make it easier for me to be here. So I look at it as an obligation to go into rooms and spaces and have sometimes the uncomfortable conversation or say the difficult things, because even as difficult as it might be, it's still easier for me than it was for my great aunt when she was a lobbyist for the California Teachers Association, or my grandmother when she was raising 14 children, or my mother who was an entrepreneur and helped my father run our printing business. And so I think about those things when I'm having conversations, and places, again, like Zora's House are so important to me, because as a leader, when I was moving through corporate America, as a person in finance, I was always one of the only Black people in the room, and that's such a heavy burden. It's such a heavy burden, and you get that that obligation of trying to show up for everybody, but recognizing, like, my experience is not the same as LC's, and as the person that is in the room, that's not in the room, that I'm also trying to think about. And so when I think about why it's important for us to have these kinds of forums, it's also to just humanize who we are as each other and recognize we have much more in common than we have that separates us. And so when I move through spaces as a leader, it's just exciting to me that we are at a place in society even as challenging as it is, and I recognize that as many advances as we're making, we have folks that would look to dismantle those advances. I still have hope and optimism that rooms like this will allow us to all go back into our various spaces and be better advocates for what we can do individually and collectively to improve outcomes for everybody.
So when I think about this question, it's interesting. I think the very insidious thing about structural racism and patriarchy and like sexism, some of these systems, is that every step forward that a woman of color takes, you are battling like an external battle and an internal battle. And oftentimes it can be hard to understand where the line is. So I will give an example. About a year after I founded Zora's House, and at this point the house existed, we'd had all these programs, we'd had this amazing response, and at that time we had been fully supported by community. So we never applied for any money, we never received any grants up until that point. And I remember I was sitting down with one of my mentors, who's not here right now, but we were sitting down having a conversation. He was like, well, why haven't you applied for any money yet? And I remember telling him, I was like, look, I do want to apply for some money, but I'm just waiting until we're a little further along, until we can show more impact, until we can we have more members, until we have more programs. And he was looking around, he was like, you built a whole house. What are you talking about? And he was just so his mind was just so blown. He was like, I don't understand. I didn't ask if we cuss. My bad, bleep that out. Sorry.
15-second delay on the radio.
Delay. I'm gonna keep it together the rest of this talk. But his mind was so blown at this idea that to him, he was like, I don't understand why you haven't moved forward. And I was basically telling him I didn't feel like I was enough. I didn't feel like my work was enough. I didn't feel like I had done enough. And he was looking around, he was like, you built a house from scratch. You have these amazing programs, these members. And what I realized in that moment, and I think we often build this into the work at Zora's House as well, is that I was dealing with some imposter syndrome. I was dealing with some moments of feeling like I wasn't enough, like my work wasn't enough. And that was an internal battle for me. And I have often been in spaces where I've been told that my work was not enough, where I was not credible enough, where I was not credentialed enough because I am a Black woman. And I would see people ask other people to prove a lot less than they were asking me to prove. So it's it is an internal thing where it's man, I was really struggling with this. And I think it becomes really challenging when we tell women and we tell women of color, oh, all you need to do is be more confident. You need to go in there and be more confident. Women, you need to change yourselves and you need to navigate things differently and not acknowledge that structurally there are places where our ideas are still not valid. There are places where we are still not paid for our work the way that we should be paid for our work, right? And so it is a both and that I think is so important. And I think for many women of color leaders and Black women leaders, when we think about leadership programming at Zora's House, there's a whole healing component. There's a whole trauma-informed component because so many of us have been traumatized in professional spaces. We have been traumatized in educational spaces and higher education spaces. And so it's not enough to just tell women of color that they need to change themselves in order to lead better. We need folks changing the community, changing the systems, changing the businesses so that we have the opportunity to lead better, to lead differently, to lead in a more courageous way.
Okay, can I tell a story?
Go ahead, girl.
So when you talk about the showing up and telling women to be more confident, I remember I was a financial advisor at Merrill Lynch, and my first client wrote me a check for $2 million. It was a big deal, right? I'm like, somebody would write me a check for $2 million? However, after the transaction, my white male site leader says to me 2 weeks later, has he asked you to marry him yet? All right. I said, no, I think his wife has that taken care of. And then it was this ongoing thing that I can't change the fact that who I am in an industry, and you get to the place where you're like, is this place really for me? You know, I maybe would have stayed in the advisor world and not been here today had I not had those experiences. I'm grateful, and in hindsight, that I went through some of the things that I did, but changing the environment so that way we don't have to be subjected to that kind of treatment. And that wasn't that long ago, y'all, because I'm not that old, right? So this is not like the 70s, like, oh, we had inequality in finance. It's still pervasive today. So when we think about why don't we see more of us leading in certain spaces, it is because of how people treat us when we show up in the room.
Yes. And I want y'all to look around when we're saying these things at all of your women of color colleagues who are nodding their heads, who are affirming, because I think it's really important to notice, like, it can be very hard to talk about these things in predominantly white spaces, professional spaces, and yet when we're here today and I'm looking out and Danielle tells this story about how she's treated, and everybody is like, yes, I've experienced that. That's a problem. That's a problem that does not sit with us. That sits with the institutions that we're a part of that need to get shifted, and we cannot and will not do that work by ourselves.
So we will move to questions from our live stream and from our in-person audiences here in a few minutes. So if you have a question, go ahead and make your way up to the microphone, which I believe is over this way. And if you're watching online, type your questions into the chat. But before we take audience questions, I have one final question for you guys. And this is maybe a tough one, but do you ever feel like you'll have a moment where you think, my work here is done? And what legacy do you want to live? Or do you want to leave for Columbus and beyond?
I mean, I would love for the legacy to be that my work is done. I think that would be an amazing legacy. I often think about Zora's House and how, you know, when I talk to partners and funders now, and, you know, I make sure I stress, even partners who are like, oh, we primarily fund basic needs. I'm like, racial equity is a basic need. But I would love to get to a point, I feel like, where Zora's House is not a need. Zora's House is a nice to have, because we like coming together and listening to Lauryn Hill and kikiing and having a good time and networking, because we like it, because it brings us joy, and that's the only reason that we're there, right? But like right now, that's not the case. It is that, plus it is needed. It is necessary in our world, and I would love to have a world where Zora's House isn't necessary. Now, some days, do I feel like that's possible in my lifetime? You know, occasionally, but most days, like, I know that, like, we're planting a seed, that, like, much of the work that Zora's House is doing now, I am not gonna see the impact in my lifetime. There are people that we've already impacted who share from me from a program they did 3 years ago, right? And it's like, these are movements, and change that takes time. And I wanna remind everybody who is a part of this movement and who is doing this work, whether because they're funding this work, they're partnering on this work, their organizations are doing this work, that like, these are systems that took generations to build, and they are gonna take generations to dismantle. And we have to have the patience and the stamina and the resources to be able to sustain the work that we're doing over the long haul in order to see that ultimate change.
Yeah, you know, Elsie, I would agree totally. I think that the work of RISE is about reducing poverty. And there's this book that I've read called Poorly Understood, What America Gets Wrong About Poverty. And one of the things that they talk about is how so many people lean into the fact that in the Bible it says, the poor will be with you always. Like, stop. We have to stop making that our excuse. Like, they said it in the Bible, so we just gonna have to have poor people. We don't have to. These are social constructs that we choose, that someone can have 18 homes and someone can also be unhoused, right? Like, why? Why are we okay with that? And I think that I believe that organizations need to always exist to make sure we have accountability. But I do think that our work, yes, I would love to get to the place where our work evolves from getting people from a place of crisis into thriving, and then we're there to keep making sure that organizations don't feel like, oh, we're done, we can go back, because we know how quick we lose our memory and we forget, like, the Great Recession was caused by instability in housing, and hey, here we go again, right? So we have to make sure somebody's always there from an accountability standpoint.
All right, so it is CMC's longstanding tradition to take audience questions. So Mantra Moody What CMC is curating questions from today's live stream audience. For those of you who are with us in person, please join Mantra. Oh, we've got some already at the microphone. And out of respect for others, please keep your questions brief and to the point so that we can get to as many as possible. And also keep in mind that questions end with a question mark.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Elsie and Danielle. Appreciate it. All right, the first question, what advice, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, Elsie, but what advice would you give the next generation to be successful?
Yeah, I feel like Danielle and I could probably both weigh in on this, but one of the things I think about often is ensuring that we are just providing ourselves with the same amount of grace that we are providing all of the folks that we're interacting with on a regular basis. I think sometimes even in my leadership journey, I get frustrated with myself because, there was a moment somebody said something and I'm like, oh, I should have said this. Like in that moment I didn't. And it's like, oh, did I let myself down? Like, did I not speak up for Black women in that moment? Did I, show myself the way I wanted to? And I think that there is so much that many of us are carrying, and that to give ourselves grace along the journey, because it truly is a journey. That's mad cliche, but I also feel like it's really true.
And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I would just say find a support system, because we talked about not trying to do this work by ourselves. Lean on leaders that have charted the path before you, because you don't need to replicate the same mistakes.
And if you're a woman of color, join Zora's House.
I'm Jody Urbanski, and I'm one of the founding members of the Aubrey Affordable Housing Foundation, and we support men and women re-entering community from incarceration. And so my question is, do you have programs that support re-entering women and the special barriers that they face?
Do you want to answer this, or you want me to? Yeah, so thank you so much for lifting that up. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight in that question is this idea that, again, women of color have a range of experiences. And so the ways that Zora's House is able to support folks with a number of different experiences is twofold. So one, we have a partner like you who comes to us and says, hey, this is the population we serve. How do we get together and make sure that there's something at Zora's House for them? Or what are the ways that we can ensure that they're moving through your pipeline of programs in a way that's really going to be supportive? And the other ways it happens is that we have folks with a particular experience or identity join our community. As I mentioned about our Business Builder program, that was because a member said, we need this, right? So we make sure that we don't consider women of color to be a monolith, and we invite women of color with a variety of different identities and experience to help us shape what programs get put into the world. So I would welcome a conversation.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Diamond. I'm with the Women's at Work program. And my question would be, how does a woman of color have a conversation with HR without being, consequences, having issues legally with them, and being able to maintain a healthy work environment?
So this is not legal advice, because I'm not your attorney. Give a disclaimer. However, I have been in that same situation, and I think that it's important that documentation, to me, is always a thing. And you'll have people that tell you, it seems like you've got to be like a paralegal when you've got situations happening, but if you think it happened, you need to document it. It has to be something so that you can go back to someone and say, this is not just what I feel, let me show you the examples and the scenarios. And unfortunately, even with all of that, especially with discrimination, and in my experience as the president of the NAACP in Cleveland, I would tell people all the time, your situation is probably real and it probably did happen, but if you can't prove it, then it just becomes one of those situations that you go through and someone's like, well, maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe your boss is only saying that to you because of that skirt that you had on and not because of whatever, right? Those types of things. So documentation, I would say, is important. And sometimes you will get that retaliation and you have to decide how much further you want to take it. And it's unfortunate. The burden is often always put on the person that's making the accusation and not the system. But I always tell people, try and talk to other people in your organization because likely they're dealing with a similar thing. And when there's power in numbers. When you've got other people that are willing to step up and say, yes, me too, I had that experience, then you have a little bit more strength when you're going into that conversation.
All right. Are there specific initiatives like Zora's House in other cities that are models for you?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it's interesting. I would say there are peers that we have in other cities that we've mainly identified over the course of like our own growth. So when I first founded Zora's House or had the idea for Zora's House, it was because I was struggling to find community in Columbus, and I was new to Columbus, and I was, mainly only knew my hubby, who's right there. He's cute. There he is. Hi. Mainly only knew him, was living in his parents' basement. Like, it was not a glamorous time for us. I was struggling to find community, and the idea for Zora's House, kind of arose out of that desire that I was feeling. And so since that time, there have been, I've had the opportunity to meet other leaders who are building communities for women of color, and they look different. So in California, there's a co-working space there called the Blackbird Collective. It's like a wellness collective. In New York, there's a space called Ethel's Club, which is meant to be, kind of this hub. And I get people emailing me all the time from across the country. I have 4 emails in my inbox right now who are like, we're trying to start something like this in Chicago. We're trying to start something like this in Tennessee. And so I think what it shows is that there is a need for this in so many cities across the country. And we're working on some ways that all of those of us who are doing this work can collaborate a little bit more, share resources, share leadership, understand each other's challenges, and support each other. Because at the moment it is very disparate, but we know that these spaces and communities are popping up all over the country right now.
How do you take innovative ideas, for example, like, hey, invest in Black women, and you take that and you're like, hey, businesses, community, people, I need you to recognize that this is a need. How do you get that community buy-in?
I think demonstrating value is an important thing when you're trying to get anybody to invest in whatever your idea is. And the moral imperative to do these things, in my opinion, is like the price of admission. We should all agree that it's morally right to support women of color. But for most people, that's not enough. You can't rest on that and say because it's the right thing to do. But I think what LC has done with Zora's House is be able to point to specific things that the organization was able to bring in terms of value to the community and to corporations and other people that would not exist but for Zora's House. And so when you're talking about investment in organizations and in people that are often disinvested or underinvested, I think the counter narrative to that is showing how much value an organization stands to derive from that. So again, the example of the natural hair care movement. All of these major brands now that are on the trend of it, it's because they see how much consumption is in the natural hair care industry. So also add value to the moral imperative, and I think that's the place that you want to be in having that conversation.
All right, this question is for Alison. Can you talk a little bit about Marker's role in supporting Zora's House?
Of course. Well, first of all, so honored to know Elsie and be a part of the project. So Elsie and I met a couple of years ago. We were the 40 Under 40 Columbus Business First group together and met. And at that time, this was an idea, I think. It was a dream, it was an idea, but she was also like, I'm gonna do this. I don't know where to start, but I'm gonna do it. And then we met soon after that to kind of talk about what that looks like, how you get started. And we actually went through a whole proposal process and competed against other firms to get involved with the project. And then we got involved early on in the design with Moody Nolan, and oh yes, Mantra's husband, and just kicked off construction recently. So and we're big fans. We've got some people on our team that are members of Zora's House, and just doing whatever we can to support Elsie and Zora's House and the mission and the work that they're doing.
And I'll say this because Alison's one, not gonna brag on herself or her firm, but we were able to reach out to Alison, and shout out to Alison because I sent her a very vague email like, hey girl, I wanna build this building. I'm not really sure. Can I talk to you about this, or is there somebody else? And she was like, I guess. And so just that openness and that willingness to have that conversation. And we were actually at a panel at Marker recently. Myself, Jonathan Moody was also on the panel. One of the things that we talked about is how important it is for people of color to have access to those type of relationships. Like if I hadn't been able to pick up the phone, call Alison, send her a direct email and be like, hey, I honestly don't even know where to start. Even that level of vulnerability, I would not have done that with just somebody that I'd never met before. And so having those relationships is so critically important. And I will also quickly say, speaking of support, there is a little card on all of your tables. There it is. Look at this beautiful, beautiful card. And so I know that in the intro, we introduced the fact that we are raising $6 million for this project. And I want to let you know that we only halfway there. So I want to give you all the opportunity to learn more about the project and how you can be involved, whether it is with a personal gift or if you represent an organization that you think would be really interested in this work. It is going to take in all seriousness, it is going to take all of us and our entire community to make this happen. So when this building gets built, it is going to be all of us who got this building built. Because I got 2 kids and I ain't got the time, y'all, so I need everybody to be involved. And you can find out more there. And we also have a table outside, so when we're leaving this space. Small PSA. Okay.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question. Are there any more?
All right. What can Columbus's leadership do better to support initiatives like Zora's House, meaning elected leadership and business leadership too?
Oh, y'all trying to get me in trouble. I ain't about to answer that. So I think, one of the things that I would say about what folks can do better, again, there's a lot of informal relationships. One of the things that we focus on at Zora's House, it's funny, one of our members entitled kind of the impact of membership is the rich auntie effect. And what they mean is that at Zora's House, it's almost like each of us individually may not have every relationship that somebody needs, but collectively, we know everybody. Whatever you need, if you bring it to our collective, if you bring it to our collective Zora's House membership, we will be able to kind of find that opportunity for you. And I'm actually thinking about when Danielle first moved to Columbus from Cleveland, there was a group of folks who got together and said, we are going to introduce Danielle to all of these other meaningful leaders in the community. And I remember getting the invite and it was like, come together. We have a Black woman who's leading in this community, and we are going to make sure you know her, make sure you understand. And there were a lot of big names that most people in this room would recognize who came together to make sure that Danielle had the relationships that she needed in order to be successful. So I think ensuring that Black women who are leading, that we at Zora's House have the relationships we need to advance our ideas is the most important thing that our leadership, that our community can do for us right now.
All right, one more question.
Hello, Danielle. I am also Danielle. Hey. Nice to meet everyone. I spend a lot of time coaching people through the delineation between Black and brown women and gender expansive people and people experiencing income instability and poverty, and how there are appropriate conversations where it makes sense to commingle them, and there are conversations where it does not make sense to commingle those two distinct groups of people. And so I'm wondering, I feel like I need a little bit of a script for the number of times that I have this conversation. And I'm wondering if you can talk through how you have this conversation with people.
So I think that being able to start off, Danielle, by what you just said in terms of the fact that there are people of all races, ethnicities, creeds, along that whole socioeconomic continuum. and not relegating one part of our community to being isolated in one of those buckets versus the other, but then also acknowledging that there are spaces and times where those things intersect. And so I try to do that with people, where I talk about my experiences, but then also share and recognize that there are people in our community who grew up affluent, and their life experience and the things that they navigated through are very different in some cases than what I navigated through. And I always tell people, you should talk to them. It's like I can't have the burden of knowing everything that everybody went through and what that was like, even as I think that LC does a great job of talking about people of color and women of color. And I would tell people when I was president in ACP, when I come to the table, I'm talking from the perspective of as a Black woman. And this conversation about people of color is broad, and I want you to do the same work to go have conversations with folks in the Latinx community, in the AAPI community. You cannot make me the token for everyone that is a person of color.
Anything else you want to add? No? Okay.
Nope, I think you said it. You said it. She said it.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are all out of time. Thank you for the amazing questions, and thank you guys. You're amazing. I will turn it back over to Tony Bell for closing.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you so much. Well, you know, everybody, I hope you feel as I do. Round of applause if you wish we had more time with this wonderful panel. So I'm going to wrap up. And, you know, certainly we hope you found that today's forum gave you a sense of hope and optimism, and that you recognize that you are enough. I hope you will join me right now in saying to yourself a very heartfelt, I am enough. Yeah, thank you for those words. You are enough. I am enough. And I hope that you find that this experience reminds you that this is an investment and not a charity, because enough is enough. So we want to thank today's sponsors, Cover My Meds, and thank Catherine Ziegler for her amazing words with our sponsor. Thank you. Thank you to the Grange Audubon Center for its support, and thank you to all of our virtual seat members and the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. A very special thank you and appreciation to our two panelists, LC Johnson and Danielle Sydnor. And of course, the amazing woman who LC's able to call and say, hey girl, Alison Marker. So please make plans now to attend next Wednesday's forum called Laying Tracks for Amtrak's expansion, right here in this building at Grange Insurance's Audubon Center.